Chapter 14 Cloud Forest Confidential. I love the smell of date palms in the morning. They smell like, cinnamon donuts, maybe? Lucky for me, there's plenty of date palms here, in the shadow of Krakatoa, and the song of the mangrove whistler echoes the jub-jub-jub puttering of the outboard motor that almost drowns out the sounds of my gastrointestinal distress. But who can think about minor concerns, such as untreated chronic dysentery, when you're surrounded by so much natural beauty? Such quibbles are a small price to pay for an extended vacation in paradise. Yeah, I suppose I could have done a lot worse than come to Sumatra for my public relations sabbatical. My agent Gabby Gersh suggested I get a little distance from all of the death and devastation that went down in New York, which is the sort of thing that's generally considered detrimental to a career in the comedic arts. Gabby says the smart move, career-wise, is to recharge my batteries in a tropical paradise for a while, far from the prying eyes and ears of the shutterbugs and gossip columnists, and outside of the jurisdiction of those pesky snoops at Interpol with their so-called international arrest warrant. The only law that counts in the cloud forest is the law of the jungle, and the first rule of the law of the jungle is don't get out of the Klotok. The Klotok is the tall, narrow boat that's rocking side to side as we head upstream through the leech-infested swamp toward our final destination, the small recursive island of Bora Gora in the middle of Lake Dibawa in the Batu Rong Ring Wildlife Preserve of south-central Sumatra. My head is still buzzing from the rounds of tuak, the locally distilled hooch made from palm sap and coconut, as Yadi gives me the TED Talk about the law of the jungle. Yadi is a Mentawai tribal elder and de facto leader of the hodgepodge of local tribesmen and hired mercenaries that form the crew, and a TED Talk is Maloney shorthand for tedious expositionary drivel. And as much as I appreciate the advice, staying on the boat isn't really an option as far as I'm concerned. No can do, Yadi. I'm here to research rangitangs, and I don't see any of them on this Klotok, so let's hear rule no more dua. Yadi takes a puff from his hand-rolled clove cigarette and tells me rule no more dua is don't eat the bushmeat, and I'm not sure if I can agree to that one either. Look, Yadi, I'm not your typical squeamish Western tourist who has a bunch of taboos about my diet. Now, I'm sure you and your friends would love to have all the bushmeat to yourself, but if I see some shrubbery with a juicy kielbasa hanging off of it, you better believe I'm gonna have a taste. Yadi just shrugs and adjusts the banana leaf loincloth that covers up his unmentionables. Rule no more tiga is don't gamble with the locals. I wish you'd mentioned that a few hours ago, Yadi, before your men swindled me out of most of my provisions. I've been up all night playing games of chance with them. Not Texas Hold'em or Louisiana Let 'em Go, but a primitive game the locals call Batu Gunting Kertas. It's a simple game of hand gestures, and it works like this. A closed fist is called a batu, a flat hand is a gunting, and a V sign on its side is called a kertas. I decide right away that I like kertas the best because it looks sharp and cutty, and kind of reminds me of Edward Scissorhands' hands. Of course, the danger of gambling with the locals is they get to make the rules, and according to them, Batu always beats Kertas, which sounds pretty fishy to me. But in any case, it wasn't long before I was swindled out of damn near all of my Charlie 6 cognac and bug spray. But luckily Leif, my affable Swedish chauffeur, stepped away from the rudder long enough to win me back most of my gambling losses. It figures that a Scandinavian would be practical enough to choose flat and boring gunting over hard and smashy batu and sharp and slashy kurtas. But somehow, Leif always knows the right move, from shaking off a swarm of chuds in Alabama to pulling my soggy keister out of the Hudson River, to traversing the North Atlantic in a hastily constructed submersible called the Titan II, soon after the tragedy in New York. The next several rules of jungle law come down to knowing who you gotta pay off or avoid, depending on which part of the jungle you're in. The black market coffee farmers call the shots in the southwest, and the palm oil pirates have reign in the northeast, and the Filipino mafia's got narcotic supply chains all across the island. In addition to the cartels and the corrupt government officials, there's the poachers. Turns out poaching is the cooking technique of choice in the jungle, as I notice hardly anyone mentions the broilers or the roasters, let alone the sous viders or the microwavers. Yachty gestures to the shallows near the shore, where the fixed eyeballs of prehistoric crocodiles and water monitors are turning visible in the first pink rays of the rising sun. Never forget, this is their domain, he tells me. It is theirs to defend. And inside this cloud forest, you're not so much facing adversaries as you are peering through a mirror, trying to outdo none other than yourself. Which sounds pretty close to some ad copy I heard in a Rolex TV spot once. Was that in a watch ad or something, I ask? Are you about to say something about patience and panache? But he gets shy and quiet and looks back toward the water. The only real rule of the cloud forest, if you want to survive, he says, is never get out of the Clotak. As if on cue, we're interrupted by an unrecognizable yowl from somewhere deep in the forest. That, says Yachty, was the cry of the gugu. Turns out the gugu is the local version of a Sasquatch or Yeti, only this one's on the short side, just a couple feet tall. And that's about the only thing the crew can agree on when it comes to gugus. They argue about whether it lives up in the treetops with the orangutans or in tunnels far below the forest floor. Eyewitness accounts of the Littlefoot playing tricks on villagers, throwing rocks at poachers, and walking backward through the forest to throw off trackers. There's even reported sightings of gugus smoking tobacco, getting zozzled on stolen flasks of tuak, and belting out Gordon Lightfoot B-sides in the karaoke parlors of Pekanbaru. Now, as I mentioned back in Chapter 6, I'm a sucker for a good Bigfoot or Loch Ness Monster story as much as anybody else. But I didn't travel all this way to listen to some superstitious natives prattle on about mythical missing links. I'm here for inspiration, and also to elude the whole international criminal manhunt thing. But while I'm here, I might as well try to find some fresh inspiration for my performance technique, using careful observation of the beasts of the forest, what my university acting teacher Tim Schwartz called animal study. I shall live among our wise and sensitive auburn-haired cousins, known to us as orangutans. If you never get the chance to live among the orangutans in a cloud forest, I feel bad for you, son.
Mitch, I didn't want to cut in, but you've said it a couple times now. The way you're saying the name of your research primate...
You mean the orangutans?
Yeah. So it looks like it's actually orangutan, so it seems to be a commonly mispronounced species.
Oh, well, I was following the Tom Connors phonetic manual. Do you have a copy of that? I'd ask them to put one in your booth.
Yeah, I have one right here.
Very well, just keep that handy, as I might also be mentioning gumboot cloggin or newfies, so...
Noted. Okay, then.
if you never have the chance to live among the orangutans in a cloud forest, I feel bad for you, son, because you're probably not very well connected. And you'll probably never know what it means to look one of them right in their big, sad eyes. There's so much wisdom in those ancient eyes. Either that or they're complete morons. It's honestly hard to know the difference. The point is, I get to do this, and you never will. So, I get it in a way that you can't. Why, you probably think all orangutans are the same. That if you've seen one orangutan, you've seen them all. That they don't have individual personalities, just like human people do. But take it from me, they're not, and you haven't, and they do. So skip ahead a few days from the boat part of the story, and I'm hundreds of feet high in the canopy of the cloud forest of Bora Gora, living in what's left of Camp Dribbly, a dilapidated wildlife research facility built in the 1970s. I hired a scrappy construction crew from my favorite reality television program, ultra-luxurious tree forts of the garishly affluent, to spruce things up just a smidge. I asked for a simple, unadorned, bare-bones roofed platform, what the locals call a pondock, with nothing to separate me from the flora and fauna of the forest than a little mosquito netting and a modest, makeshift shell of shatterproof glass, attached to a series of climate-controlled dome chambers, connected by a network of moving sidewalks and hydraulic elevators, made from the most threadbare titanium reinforced carbon fiber. There's no fancy California King mattress for me to stretch out on either. No, sir. Just a modest Arizona Archduke, and silk sheets of a depressingly moderate luster, and a thread count barely half of what I'm used to. The solar-powered shower may be state-of-the-art, but the water pressurization is sadly subpar, and the commode is made of common porcelain instead of the Venetian marble to which I've grown accustomed. My only entertainment is the wildlife and the HDTV, a half-drunk Tibetan ventriloquist, who, by the way, has limited streaming capability. Camp Dribbly was the third primate research outpost bankrolled by famous ape nerd Dr. Dagby Dribbly. First, he famously footed the bill for Jeannie Allgood, whose pioneering palling around with pansies in the Ganges literally redefined what it meant to be a human being. Then came Dinah Flusy, who roamed with the Rillas in Rwanda, and who some say single-handedly rescued the species from the brink of extinction. Next up was Joni Tackman, who was all set up to bunker with the bonobos of Borneo, but had her sponsorship pulled when it was discovered that there were no bonobos in Borneo, and the project had been initiated for purely alliterative reasons. So you can cross Joni Tackman and her non-existent sex monkeys off the list. Which brings us to Galruti Burticus, the least admired of the so-called Dribbly Three, who for decades dedicated her life to living among the orangutans of Bora Gora. She had an unconventional approach to her research that rubbed just about everyone the wrong way. She was standoffish, maybe a bit severe. They say her housekeeping left something to be desired, not to mention her hygiene. And also, she was a flagrantly megalomaniacal sociopath prone to violent rage-gasms. And then one day she simply walked into the jungle and disappeared with no explanation. Speaking of disappearing into the jungle, I wonder what Leif, my affable Swedish chauffeur, is up to. I sent him down to look for the rest of the men who, one by one, have also all mysteriously disappeared over the last few. It's hard to say. Has it been days or months? Or hours? Life moves in unpredictable ways here in Sumatra. It's what the locals call jam karet, or rubber time. And jam karet is clearly what these orangutans are running on. And also what I'm hoping is going to lead to some sort of breakthrough between us if I can just get on that wavelength. So I sit silently and just try to be present with these sensitive creatures, tang by individual tang, with no thought about the past, especially anything related to Studio 8H or the wreck of the SS Mayhem. Instead, I'm going to do what Dick Ebersol once did when he took over a particular non-pre-recorded variety program broadcast from Manhattan, just as a major writer's strike shut down production. And let me just state as a sidebar that Mitch Maloney always has been and always will be a union man. In fact, if there's one thing I believe in, it's that a block of writers standing together can accomplish just about anything. Such a writer's block can become an almost immovable object, the only kind of object that, some say, has a chance against an otherwise unstoppable force. Well, back in 1981, Big Dick took advantage of that writer's strike to use as an excuse, to use as an opportunity to take some extra time to start over from scratch and leave the past behind.
Endnote 1.
And that's what I'm trying to do with this chapter of my life. So like I mentioned before, every orangutan is unique and wonderful in its own special way. For example, I glance over to a large nearby kapok tree branch where the dominant male of the enclave, the one I call Beldar, is scratching its elbow. See? I've done that too. Yep, it's pretty much like looking into a mirror, I think to myself as he inflates his laryngeal throat pouch. A little further off, there's a little baby Connie hanging loose under the armpit of its mother Primat as she uses her oh-so-human opposable thumbs to build a nest with some fronds, just like a human mother does. Non-human primates are hairy all over, and their babies cling to them by grabbing onto their fur, is something I read once in a book by Julia Sweeney.
Endnote 2.
I know a lot of people, when they hear that name, they think of a strong ally for the LGBTQS2 plus minus asterisk hashtag community, because she once portrayed that brave and iconic character of Lyle, the effeminate heterosexual's open-minded wife. But politics aside, I'd put her just north of Piscopo and south of almost everyone else on the all-time power rankings of... Dadgummit! How come my mind keeps drifting back to that damn show? Is it because I feel somehow responsible for the horrific deaths of dozens of skit comedy legends just because technically and legally I arguably am? If only it were so simple. The fact is, my mind keeps drifting back because these orangutans are boring, or, as the locals say, membosanka, even duller than Julia Sweeney. You know what the collective noun is for orangutans, by the way? A buffoonery. No kidding. I don't know who came up with that handle, but based on the show I'm getting, I'm guessing it wasn't based on first-hand experience, 'cause these tangs are about as far from a clown show as you can get. I've seen Hassan Minaj specials with more laughs. These are some dull apes, take it from me. It's no wonder Burdick has walked into the forest, or my affable Swedish chauffeur Leif and the rest of the men, for that matter. I don't know, maybe it's my fault. I read another book by a chucklehead named Chiaran, and this guy's got takes darker than Jeselnik or Geraldo, okay? A real Mr. Doom and Gloom. And he says, man alone in nature is incapable of enduring monotony. Man alone wants something to happen at all costs. Something. Anything. Thereby he shows himself unworthy of his ancestor. The need for novelty is the characteristic of an alienated gorilla.
Endnote 3.
He doesn't mention anything specific about orangutans, though, and as far as I know, he never made it to Sumatra. But if he did, I'm sure he'd agree with me that these primates could put a little more effort into their performance. And frankly, It really boils my barnacles, 'cause the way I see it, I was lured here under false pretenses by a orangutan who turned out to be a pretty misleading specimen. So flash back with me now to a time before I decided to become a famous comedian, back when I was just another nobody, like you. The year is 2020, and I'm in Washington, D.C., tagging along as my ever-loving lady friend attends a conference for the gainfully employed, and I wander over to the National Zoo and just happen to walk in on one of the top 10 stand-up sets I've ever seen, and definitely numero uno for a non-human gagmeister. As I walk into the monkey house, I spot this one orangutan waddling back and forth, up close near where all the kids on field trips are lined up. He yanks open his lips and rubs his belly and rolls his head around with all the subtlety of a orangutan Robin Williams. And when he's got every eyeball in the place pointed right at him, wham, he lets him have it. Spews neon green puke puree all over the plexiglass, right in front of everyone's faces. Then he takes a beat to make sure everyone's still paying attention. And believe me, we are. And then he slurps the sickness right up off the glass again. And the crowd loses its mind, from reluctant chuckles to hysterical shrieks and everything in between. The younger kids are screaming, the older ones are groaning, and I'm so blown away by this virtuoso that all I can do is slow clap from the back of the crowd. I mean, you just don't see that type of showmanship every day. Now, I know some folks might say there's something wrong with keeping a sensitive, intelligent primate in a concrete box its whole life, but I say if that's what it takes to make an entertainer of that caliber, then I guess I don't want to be right. The other thing I don't want to be is up here with these damn dirty apes, not another minute. Maybe lower down near the ground I can find a droll capybara, or a witty bearded dragon with an act I could rip off. Be inspired by. But without my affable Swedish chauffeur Leif here, I can't figure out how to work the gall darn touchpad on the elevator. But I'm not one to let a minor obstacle like my inability to operate machinery get in my way. My unofficial slogan is, leap first, and a net shall appear. Turns out that approach works pretty good in show business, but not so good when it comes to physically throwing yourself off the roof of a pond dock hundreds of feet up in a tropical jungle. And yet, the old Maloney luck somehow spares me the indignity of plummeting straight down and getting pulverized on a pile of rocks. Instead, I bounce off every branch on the way down until I eventually land soft, covered with scrapes and bruises, but all in one piece, right in the middle of something fleshy and rancid. It's a corpse flower, as bizarrely beautiful as it is putrid. I can tell because of the massive signature reddish-brown polka-dotted silken petals, and also the trademark stench of rotting flesh that hits you right in the gills. I gotta get off of this thing before the stink contaminates my custom-designed gold Armani tracksuit. But the flower, growing out of the side of a tree wider than a full-size merry-go-round, is still a few dozen feet above the belching peat bog. Luckily, within hopping distance, there's a rickety old walkway, left over from the Camp Dribbly days. It's slippery with slimy moss, but I managed to find my footing. It's dark down here in the shadow of the canopy, and the way the vegetation dwarfs me on all sides makes me feel like a miniature figurine, like a little gold bowler escaped from the pedestal of an old trophy, minus the tiny bowling ball. I can hear and smell life all around me. As my eyes adjust, I see a little gray tank trudging through the underbrush. It's the exceptionally scarce Sumatran hairy rhinoceros. His rumply folds and wrinkles give it a sort of Borscht Belt vibe. He's funny looking, I guess, but not so much ha-ha funny. More of a Lisa Lampanelli kind of funny. He looks up at me for a second and then turns and bolts in the opposite direction. And then I feel a steamy gust of breath on my shoulder. A heavy rumbling noise vibrates the leaves and ripples up the flesh of my forearms. I turn to see the cat king of this particular jungle, the Sumatran tiger, crouching on a sedan-sized branch on a nearby tree, its powerful muscles rippling under the striped fur of its slouched shoulders. As it rises and moves slowly towards me, I can feel the weight of its lumbering gait over its padded footsteps, and the rancid stench of wet tiger breath almost makes me miss the corpse flower. I should be doing my animal study with the tigers. I've always been a cat person. Now maybe a full-scale Sumatran tiger might come up a little short on the giggle meter compared to a repetitively regurgitating orangutan. But a tiger's got something the orangutans don't. Swagger. There's something to be said for swagger. And I guess that something is that it's probably good to have it. Besides, I don't need any help cracking people up. I'm already the ace of japes as far as anyone who's heard my chunks about cancel culture or airport bathrooms or cheesy pleasers could tell you. Speaking of cheesy pleasers, I'm starting to feel like a bag of 'em about to get ripped open, 'cause the massive beast is out of the foliage and rearing back for a big leap right at me. It's a real half-glass full scenario, 'cause on the one hand, getting chomped to death could be a real career setback, but on the other hand, this is definitely some top-rate, up-close and personal, high-quality research. The only thing I can think of that might get me out of a jam like this would be the infamous three-finger heckler homicider. If only there had been more time when I passed through the Dark Defendu presentation in the Fiesta Ballroom at the after-party on the SS Mayhem. The secret to the legendary maneuver, Supreme Sensei Silverman said, is in the answer to the Komedo koan. How does one think the unthinkable? I know this one. Maybe this doesn't seem like great timing, what with an 800-pound feline's incisors just inches from my jugular vein. But I guess epiphanies don't happen when it's convenient. They happen when you're backed into a corner, or in my case, on the precipice of a savage disembowelment. Of course. How do you think the unthinkable? With an iceberg. And just like that, my hand contorts, pinky, index, and thumb out. I guess the after-party on the SS Mayhem wasn't a total loss, after all. Hold it. Did I just mention the after-party on the SS Mayhem? Even now, as the tiger's massive brow connects with my outstretched digits? Will I never outrun the shadow of Unky Lorne and his monstrous creation? It could be worse, I suppose. At least I didn't mention Skipper Skeet's beef bologna. Great. Now I've lost the punchline completely. Which I guess is fortunate, because instead of shattering the skull of a beautiful endangered species that I've recently determined to be my greatest inspiration, I just deflect him off to the side in a big fuzzy pile of harmless confusion. Unfortunately, the weight of the big cat knocks me back on my heels, and I teeter on the slippery walkway. A plank cracks, and I'm in free fall again, a dozen feet or so. I take one more stone to the noggin when I finally hit solid ground, and as the dimmer switch in my brain rotates all the way to full black, I think I shoulda listened to Yachty. I shoulda never got out of the Clotok.
This audio edition of Unstoppable Farce, the Mitch Maloney story, was made possible by the Seventh Reformed Church of Latter-day Witnesses, the Bleepers.